Thank you, everybody, for attending our session here today. My name is Chris Latimer. I'm one of the product managers for Google that focuses on APIs and API management. Before we start the talk today, I'm curious, have any of you or how many of you have been in a session where we've done questions and answers using Dory? OK, so it's new to a bunch of you. So this is an internal Google tool that we use all the time for big sessions like this, where we want to make sure that not only you have a chance to ask your questions, but also that from an audience perspective, you can vote up and vote down questions, so we can make sure that we're addressing and answering the things that you feel are the most important as a group. And of course, we'll have mics here and over here as well, so when we get to the Q&A portion of the talk, feel free to step up to the microphone, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So a little bit of background on me. So I joined Google about 2 years ago. Before that, I was working for a company called Apogee. A lot of you may have heard of Apogee. We're an API management platform. We got bought by Google, and so for the last 4 or so years, I've been spending almost all my time talking with customers, different companies about the API programs that they're creating, the challenges they're running into, trying to figure out how it is that we can build a platform that's going to make our customers the most successful as we can. And before that, I was interested in APIs because I was building a lot of APIs. And when I first started getting into APIs, there was a big debate sort of raging in industry between things like, should we use SOAP or should we use REST? And at the time, it seemed like SOAP had basically won. Enterprises were viewing APIs as this sort of novelty technology for the Facebooks and Twitters of the world, and not really something that serious enterprises would need or be building to satisfy their use cases. And then a couple things happened. We had things like big improvements in the way that websites worked. So we went from pages that needed to reload every time to single-page apps that are much more responsive. And if you look at frameworks like Angular and others that have come out, they natively consume this JSON. And so all of a sudden, we had enterprises building APIs to support these new types of websites. And then, of course, at the same time, mobile just became the explosion that it became. And as a result, the same type of thing applied. So if you've ever tried to consume a SOAP service from, say, like an iOS app or build an iOS app that uses SOAP, it's a pretty challenging exercise. It's pretty trivial if you're using a RESTful API. And so we had a lot of companies that were starting to build more and more and more APIs. And so it's great that today we're sitting here in sort of this completely filled room talking about APIs, and somewhat surprising that SOAP, even though it was sort of the de facto winner, is I'm pretty surprised if we find a SOAP session how to build better SOAP services on App Engine or how to optimize your Kubernetes cluster for SOAP. But we've got a lot of people that are interested in API management. So a lot of you are probably like, why are you talking about the history of APIs? What's this have to do with anything? I came to a best practices talk. So the reason why I like to start this talk by sort of describing a little historical context is that the circumstances that sort of happened around web and mobile led to a bunch of API programs sort of springing up just out of necessity without a lot of foresight. And this gives us the ability to go and sort of look at a lot of common problems that have happened from these programs, which really had no management up front. And so one of the things that the patterns that I observed as I go and talk to a lot of enterprise customers who've built out a lot of APIs is that they don't really set out to build an API program. Usually what happens is something more like this, where a project just happens to come along. Maybe we're going to build out something in Angular. Somebody says, let's build a new customer-facing website. Let's build something for our call center. Great, we're going to do that. And it just so happens that this application needs an API. We launch it. Everything's going according to plan. So far, so good, until a whole bunch of other projects come along. And each one of those projects needs to create APIs as well. So we end up with mobile apps. We end up with self-service kiosk. We end up with all these things that are needing APIs. And so then we start to run into some of the challenges, and we start to see the need for API management. So if you start looking across these APIs, you'll see that they're really not necessarily consistent. You'll see things like, maybe I've got a preferred approach for doing things like pagination. Maybe I like to use limited offset. Maybe you like to use page size and page number. Maybe somebody else likes to use a current set of records. Maybe I like to use customer uppercase I, uppercase D, and you like customer uppercase I, lowercase d, or camel cases, or all these different sort of permutations. And so what ends up happening is that as a developer, as you go to try to use these APIs, you're sort of having to learn each one over and over again. We sort of have more friction than we need to have as we're trying to build API-driven applications in our organization. The other thing that happens is we tend to run into a lot of the same type of challenges. So if you have 10 different teams that are building APIs, you may have 10 different teams that are building out solutions for things like caching, like traffic management, quotas, security, and so forth. And so not only are these APIs sort of inconsistent, but we're spending a lot more effort than we need to actually get them up and running and out the door. And then probably worst of all is that because these APIs are sort of hiding in silos within your organization, they can be hard to find. And so we end up with sort of APIs that ultimately do their purpose, but we don't get a lot of the reusability aspects out of them. We don't get a lot of the streamlined benefits, and people aren't able to find them. And usually it's about this time when companies recognize we should get more serious about API management and how we're going to manage our APIs. And so that's when they typically start to look at platforms like Apigee and start to think, what exactly is it that we should be evaluating, and what sort of capabilities should we have in an API management platform? So let's talk a little bit about that. So if you are currently, you don't have an API management platform, you've got something homegrown, or you're just sort of evaluating what sorts of capabilities should we have to be able to build an effective API program, you'll start to see things like this. So we want to have an API catalog. So discovery is important. We want people to be able to find APIs. We want people to be able to use those APIs. And we want to start thinking about things like the different audiences that we might have for those APIs. So we want to make sure our platform can do things like support internal APIs and partner APIs. Maybe when somebody signs in, we want to know which audience they're in, and we want to be able to make sure that we can put in place role-based access control to ensure that only the right people should have access to those APIs. Depending on the types of things that you're building, you might want to have self-service onboarding. So I know in companies that I worked for, a lot of times the hardest part of reuse was just being able to track down the API and talk to the right team to actually get access to those. One of the things that API management can do for you is it can streamline that entire process. So we can find the APIs, they can give you a way to get credentials, the same way you would expect to be able to go to Facebook or Twitter, sign up for their API, and start using it right away. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that within your organization as well. And of course, you should have good documentation. So this can, of course, be things like if you're using OpenAPI for documenting or specifying your API structure. We want to be able to sort of pull that in, but you may want to have additional things as well. You might want to have sort of longer form documentation that describes, here's how you get an OAuth token in our API program, or here's how we expect you to secure this API. Maybe you want to put things in place like SDKs or additional files that people can download. These are all things that you can start to think about as you are looking at the capabilities that you want from an API portal type experience. Another thing you want to think about is analytics and sort of how you're going to track things, what you need to track in your API. So of course you're going to have things like you probably want to know if all of a sudden you see a big uptick in errors that are coming through, or a big drop-off or spike in traffic, if things start taking longer than you expected. Those are all things that you want to be able to put in place. And you probably want to be able to measure business impact of your APIs as well. So in Apigee, we like to talk a lot about APIs as a product and taking your APIs and productizing those so that you can expose those to certain audiences. These can be things that are internal. Maybe you've got products that sort of represent a line of business, and you want to be able to offer those capabilities to other lines of business within your organization. Or you might want to productize for an external audience. Maybe you built things internally, but they've got some sensitive information, and you want to create something that's more partner-specific. And you don't necessarily want to go rewrite that API from the ground up. We want to be able to look at things like productization to help with that type of problem. And you may even want to tie that to monetization. So a lot of Apigee's customers actually have taken their API, the data that they've gained over time, and turned those into monetized products that they offer either to the public or to specific business partners. So that's from a sort of a consumption standpoint, but we still want to have all the capabilities that we think about typically with an API gateway. So for example, we want to have in place access control. Now, you might be looking at things like OAuth as a standard for API security, but you may need to tie into existing systems in your organization currently. Maybe you use ping for identity access management. Maybe you use LDAP or Active Directory, other products that are out there. You want to make sure that you can sort of bridge that gap between API security and the things that you have to work with in your organization. Likewise, you want to think about things like transformation and mediation. So these are capabilities where perhaps if we have all those inconsistent APIs that people have built and we don't want to go rewrite them from the ground up, you can put an API management platform in place, and maybe we can homogenize some of those query parameters that people have built. We can offer the same uniform experience to developers without actually going and rewriting everything from the ground up. You probably want to start thinking about things like traffic management and quotas. So I know I did not have a sufficient appreciation for how complex quotas could be when I joined Apogee. It actually seemed like a pretty simple problem. It was, I give you 10 calls, and I'm going to increment a counter until it gets to 10. And at 11, I'm going to stop giving you access. What's so hard about that? And then I was introduced to extremely high volumes of API traffic. And so if you start getting things like 5, 10, 15,000 requests per second, keeping a quota in sync can become a challenge. And then if that quota is distributed across multiple geographies, it becomes a really non-trivial problem. So these are some of the things you want to think about as you're looking at these gateway-type capabilities in API management. Of course, we have to think about threat protection. Anytime that we go and we want to expose our data out to the internet especially, you're going to want to make sure that you're thinking about things like, are we protecting against DDoS attacks? Are we protecting against people trying to put in place SQL injection, cross-site scripting, those type of attacks? So do we have the capability in our platform to be able to address those? And then things like caching and optimization. So a lot of times we built services that maybe have been around for a long time, back before we had sort of a lot of mobile use cases where customers expected a very quick response time. So are there opportunities for us to build and use caching in our platform to improve that overall performance and experience that we can deliver through API-driven apps? And so as you go through sort of this type of an exercise, I'm sure many of you have gone through this type of an exercise, typically you end up making a selection. You decide what platform is going to work best for you based on your use cases. And it's about that time that you kind of realize now you almost have two problems, because you still have all of the API management concerns that you have from all the APIs that you've built and all those type of problems. And then you have this new platform, and you have to figure out how exactly are we going to configure this to build a successful API program. And so just like managing anything else, when we go to manage APIs, we really have to ask ourselves, what does success look like, and how are we going to track and how are we going to measure success over time to make sure we're on target to achieve our goals? So in talking with a lot of customers, I've asked so many customers, what exactly do you envision when you think of an API program that's successful? How would you measure that? How would you think about that? And I've heard of a number of sort of common themes over time, and I've tried to categorize these. So one of the first questions that new customers want to ask is, where should we start? I mean, we've built a bunch of APIs. Should we just sort of take every API, every service we've built, dump it out on our dev portal, let people start using that? And that's one approach. It's usually not the most successful approach. Where I recommend that customers start is by looking at the end user and what's going to provide value to those end users. So I'll give you an example. So I worked with a large retailer. And so one of the first APIs that they started with, that they really started to publish and market, was a loyalty program. And so we talked about how they were measuring the value. Like, how do you know if you're actually reaching these end users? And so they did a couple things. So one is they started to look at traffic for the loyalty program. How many people were actually coming into their store because they had loyalty points and redeeming those points? They started to look, they got some early signals by API traffic. So as they rolled this out to partners and directly to consumers, they started to see, yep, we're actually getting a pretty good uptick in terms of people that are taking advantage of our loyalty program, and it's driving those customers back to the store more. And they can sort of watch that usage, in real time on a day-to-day basis. The next aspect, once you sort of have identified that these APIs are going to allow us to provide value to that end user, is to convince developers to start using those APIs. Now, for an internal program, that's not necessarily hard because we've got a little bit more control over what our internal developers are building on a day-to-day basis. But as you're looking at sort of like public-facing APIs or partner APIs where you're recruiting people, you want to make sure that you are offering something to those application developers. And that could be in the form of a better experience, new capabilities in their apps. It could be in the form of a direct monetization channel. We've got retailers that are doing things like revenue sharing monetization. So when you sign up for their API, you can actually drive monetization of your application. And then when we look at how customers are actually measuring this, one of the most common is actually looking at the number of consuming apps. So if we've been able to reach the audience that we're after, we get people to be aware of those APIs, are they actually starting to use those and build those? Have we built an API that's usable by developers and offers sufficient value? We'll also see the number of developers that are using those APIs go up substantially. And we can also watch and see how our community is growing. Do we see more questions either directly on our portal? Are we using things like Stack Overflow? We see more interests that are climbing up. And we can measure these, and we can take appropriate steps to continue to encourage that type of growth. The third thing is that the APIs, as they're being used, they generate some type of ROI for your organization. And this could be in a number of different forms. I mean, this could be from enabling more partners to onboard onto your API, sort of growing the partner channels and the number of people who can sell your products or use your data. It can be in the form, especially for internal programs, of just greater internal efficiency. I mean, there's a lot of time that's wasted by people trying to figure out, does a certain API exist? What team do I need to talk to get access to an API once I determine that it does exist? Is there a way that we can sort of drive efficiency from that aspect? Also from the aspect of, as people are building those APIs, how can we make our applications get built faster? And then we can also, of course, sometimes just take the APIs directly and monetize those. So we've got customers out there, like a large, weather site. They'll offer you, subscription bases for getting access to their weather data, for example. Others that have market data or accessing things like, credit card processing. So there are ways that we can also look at these APIs as a direct new channel of business for our organizations. So when we kind of look across, the end-to-end, going from that end user that's using the application, making sure that we're driving the ability for the developers to get those apps up and running more quickly, to use those APIs, and to ensure that we're driving the overall ROI, we can think of this as sort of happening in two parts. So the first part is API exposure. So what can we do to make the ability for API teams to create APIs very quickly, more efficiently, to be able to drive the proliferation of APIs within your organization? And then we can think about API consumption. So what are we doing once those APIs are up and running to actually make it easy for people to get access to APIs and start building those things so we can actually deliver the real tangible value to our end users? And so again, one of the things that some of the research we did leading into this talk was to go and ask customers, what are the actual KPIs that you have found that you're tracking? How do you measure the value of your API program? And so when it comes to the exposure side, sort of taking all the data and things that you've built and getting an API out more quickly, we've heard two things. So the first is speed to API. So we recognize the need for something, and we want to get it up and running and available and into the hands of developers as quickly as possible. And we don't necessarily want to do that just by throwing more people at the problem. And so we also want to make sure that the overall cost in order to get that API out the door is as small as possible. And sort of the key behind this is, where an API management platform can help is that we can eliminate a lot of the work that you would have to do otherwise. So how can we use an API platform to sort of allow us to focus in just on the things that we care about? We don't necessarily want to be experts of API management, we want to be experts of our APIs and building the underlying business logic. And so we can use an API management platform for things like security. So using API management, can we eliminate the need for individual security reviews every time an API gets published? Can we do things like embed all those standards that we have and our standard controls and policies so that anytime an API call comes in, we're going to automatically apply the right policies? Can we use it to tie into our existing IDPs and our existing capabilities so that we don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel every time? Things like traffic management. So, we start to think about some of the threats that can happen, even with data that's not necessarily sensitive. We have to be aware that even non-sensitive data can be important. So, for example, we may have like retailers that have store hours, not a sensitive bit of information, but it's something that's critical for customers that want to go and look and see if the store's open. So we don't necessarily want to open that up to the public, have a huge wave of traffic sort of flow in and take that capability down. We can use traffic management and the API management platform to be able to solve those type of use cases and protect against those type of threats. Again, caching will come into play. So can we do things like not just response caching at the edge, but can we also do things like partial caching? Maybe you look at how your APIs are structured, and you see that it would actually work better instead of what you have today if you aggregate 2 or 3 APIs. Maybe you see from analytics that there are patterns that are happening over and over again. You want to optimize those APIs, but you're scared about handing back stale data. So what we might want to do is we might want to say, well, we're going to create sort of a mashup. We're going to grab 2 or 3 different APIs and put those payloads together. 2 of those things are cacheable. We can use partial caching, and one's not, and we can still improve the overall response time and performance of that API. And then likewise, we get to things like transformation and mediation. So if you have an API that was built for maybe a client-server app or something that's running internally to your organization, and you want that to be useful for a mobile app, you can do things like mobile optimization. We can cut the payload down, sort of trim out the parts that aren't needed by the mobile app. Same thing for like data scrubbing. So if you've got an existing API that's got sensitive customer information in it, and you want to expose that to a partner, instead of building another version of that API, you can use the mediation and transformation capabilities, scrub that out, so that your same API becomes applicable and usable by more people. And then, of course, we want to be able to track and get real-time visibility into our APIs. If all of a sudden we see that things are going bad, either errors are coming up or the response time is starting to really trail off, we want to be able to get visibility into that so that we can take the appropriate action. From an API consumption standpoint, some of the things that we heard when we asked customers were time to hello world. So we built an API portal. We've let people become aware of our APIs that we've built. They can get access to those. How long does it actually take for them to start building something with it, even just a simple hello world? So how long before we see they go from a registered user to somebody that actually has an app that's been sending traffic in? So we want to be able to monitor and track that data over time, and then improve our documentation and our outreach so that we can improve those. We can also look at things like number of developers. So if we're trying to drive consumption, the consumption comes from developers that are actually building apps that are going to be using these APIs. So we want to be able to see, are we actually getting the adoption that we want? Are we reaching the audience of developers that we're after? And then are they actually building apps? Do we see an uptick in terms of the number of apps that are being built as we launch more APIs? And so how do we do that? How can API management help with that? Well, an API management program should be building a very compelling developer experience for your developers. You want them to not only see, here's the documentation, the APIs that are available, but also see what types of things are possible. We've got a lot of customers that are building things like application showcases. So it's very easy for you to go and say, oh, here's a neat app that somebody built. Hopefully that triggers ideas from other developers so that they can go build their ideas with the portal. And you want to make it very easy for people to not just sort of see what APIs exist, but actually try those out as well. So they can start using those, and they can start experimenting with the APIs and seeing how they work, as opposed to writing a little test harness or things like that. We can actually do that right within the browser with interactive docs. You can take an open API spec, load it in, create interactive documentation, and start using that really right away. And if we are able to do this successfully, we've seen some major improvements from our customers. So here's a good example from Walgreens. So they've been a customer for a really long time. So what they started out with, they actually started out with an API called the Quick Prints API. So somebody at Walgreens recognized that we have all of these photo printers that are sitting in our stores, and everybody, some of you right now, are taking photos with your phones, and a lot of times they just kind of sort of stay on the phone. People aren't printing them off anymore. So what could Walgreens do in order to make it easy for people to take those photos, send them into the store? And their answer to that question was, we'll build a Quick Prints API. So we'll build an API, we'll put it on our mobile app that'll let people take those pictures, send it to the store. Hopefully we'll get a little trickle of revenue that comes in and sort of justifies this space in our store. And what they found is they didn't get a little trickle of revenue. They got a tremendous boost in terms of those users. So the users that were actually interacting with Walgreens on their mobile channel, on their store channel, their brick and mortar and online, were spending about 6x what anybody else was, the folks that would just come into the store. Because these customers were coming in to pick up their photo, and then they were buying shampoo, they were buying toothpaste, they were buying whatever else that they needed at Walgreens, and it ended up being sort of a real eye-opener for them. Once they realized that, they said, we should open this up. We should take this API, and we should let anybody use our Quick Prints API. And so they started to offer this to lots of other mobile apps that are out there that allow you to take photos and print photos off. And so now they're up to about 300 partners that are building APIs on top of this Quick Prints. And that's 300 partners that are constantly sending people into the stores to come in to pick up those photos and buy other things at Walgreens. And it's just made a tremendous impact. And so when I think of a successful API program, I view Walgreens as really the archetype that I feel like a lot of companies should strive for, because it's not just necessarily an IT problem, it's really something that can deliver tremendous overall business value.